Hi, I'm Alex.
And I'm Danny.
And we're Seriously Nerdy.
About Parks and Rec. If you too are a fan of the show Parks and Recreation, you may remember this painting done by Jerry from season 3 of the show. We are a big fan of this episode, so we thought it would be fun to create it as a diorama. We started with Hero Forge, the tabletop miniature building platform, as a way to completely customize figures that would work for the characters in the diorama. And since the theme of the episode is censorship and art, it seemed only fitting to begin our build by painting the censor bar. A little background for those of you that haven't seen this episode: a character named Jerry submits a painting to a local art show, and then the twist comes when the Parks and Recreation Department realizes that Jerry has unintentionally used his co-workers as inspiration for the mythical creatures depicted in the painting. Amy Poehler's character Leslie is seen as Greek goddess Diophina, and Aziz Ansari's character Tom is shown as a baby-like cherub. So naturally, chaos ensues. For this diorama, we were inspired by the fact that this is a painting, so we wanted to really leave in heavy brush strokes and try to mimic the colors and shading from the actual reference painting as much as possible. It's definitely a looser painting style. I don't know that it would work in a lot of instances, but for something like this, where we had a real painting to reference, it was fun to work with looser brush strokes and more expressive painting style, just to try to mirror Jerry's painting the best we could. I had actually started this project in a different iteration in 2020 because we'd found a female centaur and a cherub tabletop miniature from Reaper Miniatures, and we were so delighted by the idea that we thought we'd give it a go, but because those were pewter figures, we weren't able to change the poses or the facial expressions, and after a couple hours I realized that it just wasn't going to sell the look of the painting. So we were so delighted when the Hero Forge tabletop miniature generator started doing centaur figures, then they introduced cherubs, and I think in this latest batch we got this very handsome deer/elk. So finally all the pieces were in place to not only design these in the scale that we wanted, but to be able to really model their poses and expressions so that we could capture that exact moment from Jerry's painting. Now you may be thinking to yourself, surely there are shadow boxes on the internet that you could just build this inside of. And you would be right, but for this particular build, we knew that we needed the diorama to have the exact aspect ratio that the painting has in order to sell the position of characters where they're supposed to be and with the other elements of the environment. The easiest way to do this was just to 3D model it in Tinkercad. Tinkercad, which many of you know I am obsessed with, is a 3D modeling program designed for kiddos, but is available for free for everyone, and is a very user-friendly way to bring 3D designs to life. So with the diorama housing itself 3D printed and painted up, it was time to figure out what to do with the outside of this diorama. We knew the inside would have a very sweet seat, but we didn't want the outside to just be a silver box. Cue the cricket joy. I was able to find some key quotes up from the episode online and typed those up using a typewriter font, and Cricut printed them out so that they look like pages of a script. One of our favorite things about this series is that the writing is really, really clever, so I love that we were able to pay tribute to the dialogue of the episode on the outside of the diorama. With the ceremonial blessing of Gimlet's tail, it was time to begin painting the back wall of the diorama. This particular build took some planning because we had to determine which elements would be physical in the shadow box itself and what things would live only on the walls. I guess it's kind of like a tiny museum exhibit. Like there's got to be someone out there whose job it is to figure out where the taxidermied animals and nature stops and the back wall of the exhibit begins. Am I just a museum curator now? But like a museum curator that only makes tiny pop culture dioramas? Maybe so. But now feels like a good time to tell you that Alex and I watched a lot of Bob Ross during the pandemic, and I mean a lot. like we may have made it through every episode. And while I never did a Bob Ross paint-along where I followed his instructions and made my own thing, I paid attention to his happy little trees, and also I've taken a couple art classes before. So for this portion of the build, I was just trying to mirror Jerry's painting as closely as I could, paying attention to where he placed shadows and highlights and what sort of colors he was pulling in, but I was choosing to not paint any of the feature elements of the painting. So the trees that are in the foreground, or the Leslie or Tom or deer figures, those elements are going to be physically built in the diorama, so I'm just imagining what might exist behind them. And voila, we have a tiny Jerry painting. And it wasn't until this portion of the build where I realized we were gonna have to figure out what to do with the sides. For a while, I considered leaving them just black 3.0 and hoping that they faded, but I thought that that might look a little strange if you view it from the side at all. So I did a quick Google search for references of forests and pulled 8 or 10 reference images, and then just invented a forest scape in my brain that might exist on either side of this river view. The most important things for continuity are making sure that your skyline stays consistent, that you have that same horizon line, and that you're paying attention to what direction the sun is shining. Everything else I'm pretty loosey-goosey with, but I made sure that the horizon line is consistent and the lighting is sort of from the same direction sometimes. I took a landscape painting class once. I was incredibly intimidated, but the instructor was so kind, and his challenge to us for the entire course was to paint landscapes using a really limited color palette, because that forces your brain to see color in a different way than if you had access to every color on your paint palette. And I thought that might be a nice way to approach these background paintings as well. So for these, I had access to black and white, and then I gave myself a creamy yellow, really saturated navy, a really saturated turquoise, and kind of a coppery rust color. And then everything else you're seeing me pull out is just combinations of those colors. So for something like this, where we want the background to just become part of the diorama, it's a nice way to create cohesion through color. When we started this build, I had not planned on having a lighting element. If I had planned for it, I would have a cute little case or a way to conceal the cables or the on-off switch. But when we got to this point in the build, we realized that it might be helpful to be able to see the background painting with a little more clarity, or pick up on the Tom cherub figure who's going to be positioned a little bit further back. So we quickly improvised a plan to light it using a simple LED lighting kit that we already had on hand, and when we got to this stage of placing the terrain, fortunately we were early enough to be able to hide that wire under some epoxy sculpt and foil elements that were going to serve as the hills of the terrain. The original plan was to add grass flocking over the hills like you would see in a standard diorama, but we realized that since we were leaning so far into this painterly style, we might want to try a different approach. So I cut pieces of fleece to size in different areas of the diorama and soaked them in Mod Podge and let those dry to give me a really textured hillside that I could add brush strokes to. And then I decided to blend those areas out with just a little bit of mud terrain and scattered some sand in places where we need it. The goal was not so much to look realistic, the goal was to give me interesting textures so that when they dried, it would suggest a landscape, but something that I could cover up with paint. When I 3D modeled this box, the two things that I was proudest of is that it's got a slope on the back so you don't have a hard edge that separates the back plane from the ceiling, but also it allows me access into the bottom and sides of the diorama or the back wall and the ceiling, and I don't have to worry about reaching my hand in or trying to tweezer place things like you do into a standard shadow box. This two-part build, I'm telling you, we're onto something. So with all of my terrain primed and ready for paint, I took the same approach that I did for the figures and for the sidewalls and thought about every aspect as a painting surface. The goal was not to make a realistic version of Jerry's painting, The goal was to make a 3D version of Jerry's painting. In a lot of instances, that meant that I left areas in hard shadow very dark and didn't give them a lot of detail. In other instances, it meant adding wildly unrealistic highlights or color placement because that's how they look in the painting. It was a really fun thought experiment to try to mimic this painting as close as possible without letting my rational brain creep in too much. We've been rewatching Parks and Recreation as research for this project, and it is still one of our very favorite TV series. It is something we are genuinely, seriously nerdy about. So it has been a joy to spend time evaluating Jerry's painting and assessing its artistic merits. I think the themes of that episode about censorship and art and the role of gender ideology and how that applies to art are as relevant today as they were when the episode first aired, which is just one of the many reasons why the fact that the show is celebrating its 15th anniversary is such a big deal. So, happy anniversary, Parks and Recreation. We love you so much. Hashtag not sponsored. Hashtag fan-made art. Hashtag please don't sue us. There comes a point in every build where all of the elements are complete and you just have to assemble it. And in your mind, you tell yourself that that's going to take like 45 minutes tops. It never does. It always takes so much longer than I think. For this one, we decided to use UV resin to attach the Tom figure to the back wall, and that held beautifully. We decided to create a peg for Leslie, a little metal rod that ran from her foot down, but this dang deer refused to stay in place. I tried every form of glue. I gave him a little wire peg. He would not stay in place. And I don't want to hope that he gets hit with an arrow, but at this point, if he gets shot by Leslie's arrow, I'm not going to feel that bad for him. After we finally got him in place, we could turn our attention to the outside, which was some distressing of the script pages and using a store-bought frame to create the facade that wrapped around the front. That's all we've got for this build. Thank you so much for watching, and please enjoy some final footage.